The ship's engines roared as it touched down on the desolate surface of Erion IV, a planet forgotten by most of the galaxy. Beneath the thick cloud cover and endless stretches of barren terrain, the small settlement of Vexton thrived like a stubborn weed. The air was thick with tension, a silent hum of desperation among its inhabitants, who barely made ends meet scavenging and trading scraps from long-abandoned starships. Among them was Lyris, a young alien woman with shimmering, translucent skin that glowed faintly in the dark, her bright azure eyes a striking contrast to the grime-covered settlement she called home. Her people, the Myrians, were a species known for their ethereal beauty but cursed with frailty and dependency on other species for survival. In a galaxy brimming with opportunity, her people had become outcasts, seen as weak and expendable. Lyris had grown up watching her kind endure a constant struggle for dignity, a fight they often lost. But tonight, the fight wasn't for dignity. It was for survival. Lyris hurried through the narrow streets of Vexton, the cold, metallic air biting at her skin as she clutched a thin, tattered cloak around her shoulders. Fear gnawed at the edges of her resolve, her heart racing with every step closer to the cantina. The distant hum of machinery and muffled voices added to the oppressive atmosphere as she approached a dilapidated cantina at the edge of the settlement. Inside, the warm glow of dim lighting did little to chase away the shadows. Her heart pounded as she scanned the room, her gaze locking onto the figure she'd heard about through whispered rumors. Sitting at the far end of the room, nursing a drink and staring blankly at the table, was a human. Humans were rare in this corner of the galaxy. Where most species stuck to the safer trade routes, humans were often explorers, risk-takers, or outcasts themselves. But this man, he was different. His name was Callen, and though he carried himself with a calm demeanor, there was something about him that felt unyielding, almost dangerous. Lyris hesitated, her nerves nearly overwhelming her. But she couldn't back down. Not now. Steeling herself, she crossed the room, each step echoing loudly in her ears. Callen didn't look up as she stopped in front of him. His fingers traced the rim of his glass, a slow, deliberate motion, while his eyes stayed fixed on the swirling amber liquid, betraying no reaction to her presence beyond an air of guarded detachment. "You're the human, right?" she asked, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to sound confident. He raised his head, his eyes a piercing shade of green meeting hers with a mix of curiosity and indifference. "Depends who's asking. I need your help," she said quickly, the words spilling out before she lost her nerve. "It's life or death." Callen's brow furrowed slightly, but he didn't respond right away. He set his drink down and leaned back in his chair, studying her with the quiet intensity of someone who'd seen more than his fair share of trouble. "Go on," he said finally, motioning for her to sit. Lyris sat down, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She told him about her situation, her voice steadying as the story unfolded. The Myrians of Vexton had been targeted by a group of mercenaries hired by a powerful galactic conglomerate. The mercenaries claimed the settlement was on corporate land and had demanded an impossible sum of credits in exchange for their safety. If the Myrians couldn't pay, they'd be driven out, or worse. "We don't have the money, and we don't have the strength to fight them off," Lyris said, her voice breaking slightly. "But I heard about you. They say you're different. That you've survived things no one else could." Callen's lips twitched briefly, an almost imperceptible curve that could have been amusement or a warning, his eyes remaining cold and calculating as they locked onto hers. "And you want me to take on a group of armed mercenaries all by myself?" "No," Lyris said quickly. "I'm not asking you to fight them. I'm asking you to help me find a way to protect my people. To give us a chance." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Why me? What makes you think I'd care?" Lyris hesitated, searching for the right words. "Finally," she said, "because you're human. And humans, you're different. You don't back down from impossible odds. You fight for what matters, no matter the cost. It's what makes you human, different from anyone else I've met. I've seen it in the way you face danger, and I can't help but admire it." Callen's expression darkened, his gaze turning distant. He seemed to wrestle with something unseen, a weight that bore down on him even now. "I don't know who's been feeding you fairy tales about humanity," he said, his voice low. "But most of us aren't heroes. Most of us are just trying to survive, Same as you. Lyris's chest tightened, her desperation threatening to spill over. She reached across the table, her hand brushing against his. Please, she whispered. If you won't do it for them, do it for me. I don't have anyone else to turn to. For a long moment, Callen didn't move. Then, with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the galaxy, he nodded. All right, he said. I'll help you. But don't expect miracles. Relief washed over Lyris like a fleeting tide, her breath catching for a moment. Yet the heavy weight of what lay ahead pressed firmly on her shoulders, the shadow of looming danger a constant reminder that this was only the fragile beginning of a perilous journey. As they left the cantina together, the flickering light from the doorway casting their shadows long across the ground, she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just made a deal with a force far more unpredictable than the mercenaries threatening her people. And as Callen's gaze lingered on the horizon, his hand resting on the holstered weapon at his side, she couldn't help but wonder what kind of man she'd just enlisted to fight for her cause. The desert wind howled as Lyris and Callen stepped out of the cantina, the weight of their uneasy partnership hanging in the air. The settlement's dim, flickering lights barely illuminated the rough terrain ahead. Lyris led the way, her movements quick and purposeful, though her heart pounded with doubt. Each glance over her shoulder felt like a futile attempt to spot the shadows of her fears, failure, betrayal, or worse, the lives of her people slipping away. Callen followed silently, his boots crunching against the gravel in measured steps. His sharp gaze swept their surroundings, every movement deliberate, his hand near the weapon at his hip, as if bracing for an ambush that might never come. They reached a small, weathered shack on the outskirts of Vexton. The building leaned precariously to one side, its walls patched with mismatched scraps of metal and plastic. The wind pushed against it, creating faint groans that mingled with the acrid tang of rust and decay, a fitting reflection of the desperation inside. Lyris pushed open the creaking door, revealing a cramped interior cluttered with makeshift furniture and scattered tools. A handful of Myrians, their translucent skin dim and dulled, sat huddled together, their expressions a mixture of fear and hope as they turned to face the newcomers. "This is Callen," Lyris said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "He's agreed to help us." The Myrians murmured among themselves, their wide eyes darting toward the human. Callen's imposing figure and unyielding expression seemed to carve an invisible barrier between him and the Myrians. Their wide-eyed stares flickered between fear of the stranger's potential and reluctant curiosity about whether he could truly save them. One of them, an older Myrian with a deep scar running across his cheek, stepped forward. His gaze was hard as he studied Callen. "You're the one she's bringing into this?" the elder asked, his voice rough and skeptical. "A human?" Callen met his gaze without flinching. "I've faced worse than a few mercenaries," he said evenly. "If you want to survive this, you'll need someone who knows how to handle a fight." The elder frowned, but before he could reply, Lyris stepped between them. "Here's our best chance," she said firmly. "We don't have the luxury of being picky." After a tense moment, the elder relented with a nod. "Fine," he muttered. "But if this goes wrong, it'll be on your head, Lyris." The group gathered around a makeshift table in the center of the room, where a holographic map of the settlement flickered weakly. Lyris gestured to the map as she began explaining the situation in detail. The mercenaries, she revealed, had set up a base on the outskirts of Vexton, heavily armed and fortified. Their leader, a ruthless man named Garon, had a reputation for crushing resistance without mercy. "We don't stand a chance in a direct fight," Lyris admitted, her voice heavy with frustration. "But if we can disrupt their supply lines or sabotage their equipment, we might have a shot at driving them out." Callen studied the map in silence, his mind already working through the possibilities. After a moment, he spoke. "They're expecting you to roll over," he said. "That's their mistake. If we hit them hard and fast where it hurts, we can make them think twice about staying here." The elder scoffed. "And how exactly do you plan to do that? They've got numbers, weapons, and resources we can't match." Callen's lips curled into a faint smirk. "You don't need to match them. You just need to make them believe you're more trouble than you're worth." He began outlining a plan, his voice calm and methodical as he described each step. They would target the mercenaries' fuel supplies first, creating a series of small, coordinated explosions to sow chaos and confusion. While the mercenaries scrambled to respond, a second group would infiltrate their base and disable key systems, including their communications and defensive turrets. "It'll take coordination and timing," Callen said. "But if we pull it off, they'll be left scrambling to regroup. That's when we make our move to negotiate." The Mirians listened intently, their initial skepticism giving way to a spark of hope. Lyris couldn't help but feel a flicker of admiration for Callen's confidence and clarity. Despite his gruff demeanor, there was a sharp mind at work behind those piercing green eyes. "It's risky," the elder said, his tone grudgingly respectful. "But it might just work." "It'll work," Callen replied firmly, "if you stick to the plan." Over the next few days, the settlement buzzed with quiet activity as preparations got underway. Callen took charge of training the Mirians, teaching them basic combat techniques and how to handle the crude weapons they'd managed to cobble together. Lyris threw herself into the effort, organizing supplies and rallying her people, her determination infectious. Despite the grim circumstances, moments of camaraderie began to emerge. Callen's sharp wit and dry humor occasionally broke through his stoic exterior. When he muttered, "Great, another patchwork drone. Should we give it a medal?" the hesitant chuckles of the Mirians softened the tension, though Lyris caught herself smirking despite the gravity of their situation. Lyris found herself drawn to his unshakable resolve, even as she wondered what had driven him to this remote corner of the galaxy. One night, as they worked late repairing a damaged drone, Lyris finally asked the question that had been nagging at her. "Why are you helping us?" she asked softly, her gaze fixed on the drone's flickering interface. Callen didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and distant. "Let's just say I owe someone," he said, his voice low and weighted with an old ache. "Someone who pulled me out of a place I didn't think I'd ever leave." Lyris looked up at him, searching his face for more, but he said nothing further. Still, his words lingered in her mind, adding another layer to the enigma that was Callen. As the day of the operation approached, the tension in the air grew almost unbearable. The Mirians knew the stakes. Failure wouldn't just mean losing their home, it would erase their fragile community and the stories, rituals, and shared hopes that kept their identity alive. Yet, as they looked to Callen and Lyris for guidance, they found a sliver of hope to cling to. On the eve of the mission, Lyris stood outside the shack, gazing up at the distant stars. Callen joined her, his presence as steady as ever. For a moment, they stood in silence, the weight of what lay ahead pressing heavily on both of them. "You think we can really pull this off?" Lyris asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Callen glanced at her, a flicker of something almost reassuring, perhaps respect or quiet resolve, crossing his otherwise stoic face before returning to its usual unreadable calm. "We don't have a choice," he said simply. "But if anyone can do it, it's you." His words took her by surprise, a quiet affirmation that steadied the turmoil in her heart. As she turned back to the stars, a newfound determination burned within her. Whatever the outcome, they would fight not just for survival, but for the chance to reclaim their dignity and their future. As dawn broke over the settlement of Vexton, the air was thick with tension and anticipation. The soft glow of the rising sun barely pierced the dusty haze that hung over the landscape. Inside the cramped shack, the Mirians moved in hushed silence, their tense expressions and the nervous twitch of their hands betraying their inner turmoil. The faint clinking of tools and the muted hum of the holographic map were the only sounds breaking the still air. The weight of what lay ahead pressed heavily on their shoulders. Callen stood at the makeshift table, his hands splayed across the flickering holographic map. His sharp green eyes scanned the layout with a precision that hinted at years of experience, though a flicker of doubt momentarily crossed his hardened features before he set his jaw with determination. His sharp green eyes swept over the Mirians gathered around him, their faces a mixture of fear and determination. They were not soldiers, they were farmers, scavengers, and workers forced into a fight for survival. Yet, despite their lack of experience, they held on to a fragile hope, a hope that Callen's plan might just save them. "Stick to your assignments," Callen said, his voice firm but calm. "Timing is everything. If we're off by even a few seconds, this whole thing falls apart." Lyris stood beside him, her luminous skin casting a faint glow that seemed to reflect her determination. She had taken on the role of coordinating the teams, and her calm authority had earned the trust of her people. Yet, as she listened to Callen's instructions, a knot of anxiety tightened in her chest. Failure was not an option, too much was at stake. "We'll hit their fuel depot first," Callen continued, pointing to a blinking marker on the map. "That'll draw their attention and force them to divide their forces. Once they're distracted, Team 2 will move in and disable their communications and turrets." "And Team 3, the elder Mirian asked, his gruff voice breaking the tense silence. Callen straightened, his gaze unwavering. "Team 3 stays back and guards the settlement. If something goes wrong, they'll be our last line of defense." The elder nodded, his skepticism tempered by a reluctant respect for the human's tactical mind. The room fell silent again as Callen's words sank in. This was it, the moment they had spent days preparing for. With a final nod, Callen stepped back from the table and motioned for everyone to gear up. The operation began under the cover of twilight. Lyris led Team 1 through the maze of derelict buildings on the outskirts of Vexton, their movements swift and silent. The fuel depot loomed ahead, a cluster of rusted tanks surrounded by a chain-link fence. Mercenaries patrolled the area, their heavy boots crunching against the gravel as they scanned the perimeter. Lyris signaled for her team to stop, her heart pounding in her chest as the faint sound of heavy boots drew closer. Her mind raced, imagining the mercenaries spotting them and the disastrous consequences that would follow. The faint crackle of the flames in the distance seemed deafening in the silence. She glanced back at them, their faces pale but resolute. With a deep breath, she activated the small explosive device in her hand and tossed it toward the nearest tank. The device landed with a soft thud, and a moment later, a deafening explosion rocked the ground beneath them. The mercenaries shouted in alarm, their attention drawn to the billowing flames and thick black smoke rising from the depot. Lyris wasted no time, motioning for her team to retreat as the mercenaries scrambled to contain the fire. From his vantage point atop a nearby building, Callen watched the chaos unfold. The acrid smell of smoke mixed with the shouts of mercenaries scrambling to respond, his grip tightening on his weapon as he calculated their every move. He spoke into the comlink clipped to his jacket. "Team 2, you're up." Team 2, led by the elder Mirian, moved quickly toward the mercenaries' base. The sound of the explosion had drawn most of the guards away, leaving the perimeter defenses vulnerable. The team slipped through a gap in the fence, their movements precise and coordinated. Inside the base, the elder's keen eyes locked onto the communications tower. He gestured for his team to follow with a firm nod, his face a mask of resolve. Yet, deep within, he thought of the countless stories of his people that hung in the balance. They reached the tower's control panel, a jumble of wires and blinking lights. One of the younger Mirians stepped forward, her hands trembling as she worked to disable the system. Sweat beaded on her brow as the seconds stretched into an eternity. "Hurry," the elder urged, his eyes darting nervously toward the entrance. Finally, the system powered down with a soft whir, and the lights on the panel went dark. The elder allowed himself a brief moment of relief before motioning for the team to move to their next target, the defensive turrets. Back at the settlement, Team 3 stood ready, their makeshift weapons at the ready as they watched for any signs of trouble. Among them was a young Mirian boy, barely old enough to hold the crude blaster in his hands. He stood near the edge of the group, his wide eyes scanning the horizon for movement. "Keep your focus," one of the older Mirians said, placing a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. "We're counting on you." The boy nodded, his grip tightening on the weapon. Despite his fear, he stood tall, determined to protect his home. The plan seemed to be going smoothly, but a creeping unease settled over Callen. His sharp eyes darted across the horizon, and his breath hitched as a subtle shimmer of metal caught the light, setting his instincts on high alert. A subtle glint of metal in the distance sent a jolt through him, a warning he couldn't ignore. From his vantage point, he scanned the area, his sharp eyes catching a glint of metal in the distance. His stomach sank as he realized what it was. "Sniper," he muttered, his hand moving to his weapon. He activated his comlink. "Lyris, get your team out of there now. They've got backup coming in fast." Lyris's voice crackled in response. We're almost clear. What about Team 2? I'll handle it, Callen said, already moving. The mercenaries' reinforcements arrived faster than anticipated, their vehicles kicking up plumes of dust as they roared toward the settlement. Callen intercepted them before they could reach the base, his weapon blazing as he took out the lead vehicle's driver. The vehicle skidded to a halt, blocking the others behind it. Team 2, finish your mission and get out of there, Callen barked into the comlink. I'll buy you as much time as I can. The battle escalated quickly, the sharp crack of gunfire and barked commands reverberating through the air. Callen focused on a lone mercenary reloading by the flaming wreckage, his steady aim cutting through the chaos. Dust and smoke swirled around Callen as he moved with practiced precision, each shot purposeful. Callen fought with the precision and intensity of someone who had faced death more times than he could count. Despite the odds, he held his ground, drawing the mercenaries' attention away from the Myrians. At the base, Team 2 successfully disabled the turrets and began their retreat. The Elder glanced back at the towering communications tower, now dark and lifeless, and allowed himself a small, grim smile. They had done it, but at what cost? By the time Callen returned to the settlement, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting the land in shadow. The Myrians gathered around him, their expressions a mix of awe and relief, while Callen's blooded form seemed to carry the weight of their shared victory and the battles yet to come. Blood trickled from a gash on his forehead, and his steps were heavy, but his eyes burned with the fire of determination. He was blooded and bruised, but his expression was resolute. The Myrians gathered around him, their faces reflecting a mixture of relief and awe. We held them off, Callen said simply. But this isn't over yet. His words hung heavy in the air, a stark reminder of the fight still ahead. Yet, for the first time in what felt like forever, the Myrians had hope. They had stood together and struck back against those who sought to destroy them. And as Callen looked at Lyris, her luminous eyes meeting his with unwavering resolve, he knew they had a chance, a real chance, to reclaim their future. The fires of the battle had long since died down, leaving the settlement of Vexton cloaked in an eerie quiet. The mercenaries had been driven away, their resources depleted and their confidence shattered. For the first time in years, the Myrians stood together without the weight of immediate danger looming over them. But victory did not come without a price. Callen sat on the edge of the settlement's central platform, staring out at the horizon as the twin moons of Erion IV cast their pale glow across the barren landscape. His thoughts drifted to the faces of those who had fallen, the young boy's unwavering courage, the elders' steady guidance. Their sacrifices weighed on him, but with it came a fierce resolve to honor their memory by ensuring their struggles were not in vain. His face was lined with exhaustion, and his body bore the marks of the fierce fight. Yet his expression was calm, almost serene, as if he were finally at peace with himself. Lyris approached him, her luminous skin catching the moonlight in soft waves. She held a small bundle of supplies, which she set down beside him before sitting at his side. For a moment, neither of them spoke, content to share the silence of the night. We did it, Lyris said finally, her voice trembling with a mix of relief and disbelief. Her hands fidgeted in her lap, and her luminous eyes scanned the settlement, taking in the small signs of renewal, children playing near the repaired fences and lights flickering back to life in the homes. Callen nodded, his gaze never leaving the horizon. You did it, he said. I was just the hammer. You were the one who held it. Lyris smiled faintly, though there was a sadness in her eyes. Not everyone made it, she said softly. There were losses. Sacrifices. There always are, Callen replied, his voice heavy with experience and a tinge of sorrow. But what matters is what you do after. I've seen people rebuild from less, and it's always about finding the strength to start again, even when it feels like there's nothing. Lyris looked at him, searching his face for the answers she had sought since the day she asked for his help. What about you? She asked. What kind of future are you building? Callen's lips twitched into a faint smile. I don't know if there's a future for me, he said. Not in the way you mean. But I've learned one thing, it's not about where you end up. It's about what you leave behind. Lyris's gaze dropped to her hands, which rested in her lap. She thought of the Myrians who had given their lives, the brave young boy who stood guard, trembling but unyielding, and the elder whose wisdom and steady leadership had guided them to this moment. Their memories were a weight she would carry, but also a gift that fueled her resolve to lead with purpose. They had all left something behind: hope, strength, a reason to keep fighting. "You've given us a chance," she said, her voice firm. "A chance to rebuild, to be more than what we were. For that, I can never thank you enough." Callen shook his head. "Don't thank me," he said, pausing briefly as if searching for the right words. "Just make it count. That's all I need." In the weeks that followed, the settlement transformed. The Myrians worked tirelessly to repair the damage, their efforts driven by a newfound unity and purpose. They turned the remnants of the fuel depot into an energy hub, restored their marketplace, and planted a small community garden, each project a symbol of their resilience and determination to thrive. The fuel depot that had once belonged to the mercenaries now powered their homes and machinery. The defensive turrets they had disabled were repurposed to protect the settlement from future threats. And the stories of their victory spread, reaching other Myrian communities and inspiring them to stand up for themselves. Callen stayed just long enough to witness the first signs of a new beginning. He watched as Lyris stood before her people, organizing rebuilding efforts with steady confidence, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had embraced her role as both a leader and a protector. She had grown into someone her people could look to with pride and trust. It was a future worth fighting for, and Callen knew it was time for him to move on. On the morning of his departure, Lyris found him near the outskirts of the settlement, preparing his ship for takeoff. She hesitated, her emotions warring within her, before finally speaking. "You don't have to go," she said. "There's a place for you here." Callen paused, his hand resting on the open hatch of his ship. He turned to face her, his expression gentle but resolute. "This is your place," he said. "Not mine. My work here is done." Lyris stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "Will I see you again?" He smiled, a hint of warmth breaking through his stoicism. "Maybe," he said. "But you won't need me. You've got this." As his ship lifted off, Lyris watched it disappear into the sky, a mixture of gratitude and longing in her heart. She turned back toward the settlement, the rising sun casting its golden light over the land. There was still much to be done, but she knew they would face it together. The moral of their story became a beacon for others. True strength lies not in power, but in unity. As Lyris retold it, she spoke not just of victory, but of the courage it took to stand together and rebuild a future from the ashes, inspiring neighboring communities to find their own resilience. It is forged in the courage to stand together, to fight for what is right even when the odds seem insurmountable. And in the end, it is the hope we leave behind that defines the legacy we build. As the Myrians worked to rebuild their lives, they carried this lesson with them, their resilience a testament to the sacrifices made and the bonds forged in the fires of adversity. It was a story they would pass down for generations, a reminder that even in the darkest times, the light of hope can shine brighter than ever.